In the last few months, Ukraine has been front and center in the news and current geopolitics, whether it is about war with Russia or a connection to Donald Trump's impeachment trial. A country with a rich heritage, it has struggled since its newly won independence with economic woes, political corruption, and an aggressive neighbor. In this session, our expert panelists will discuss the importance of Ukraine's history, culture, socioeconomics, and politics to understanding its place in European and international contexts. I am pleased to welcome today's discussants. We have Professor Scott Cooper, who is a political scientist, and Professor Jeff Hardy, who is a historian, and Professor Katya Jordan, who is a Russian professor. Well, she is Russian, and she teaches Russian. So there we go. And so our format is that we listen to their conversation for 35 or 40 minutes, and then we take questions, and by we, I mean they. So if you will come up when we ask our discussion to cease and open it up to you to the mic, which is here by the map. And if you would introduce yourself and tell us your major and hometown, that's always of interest. And we'll go until 5 o'clock. Thank you.
Okay, let's get started. It's so good to see you, Scott and Katya. Yeah, a recent official in the Trump administration said that Americans just don't care about Ukraine, and I'm so glad to see you guys because I know that you care about Ukraine, and I'm very hopeful that others can find Ukraine on the map at least, and have some interest in this part of the world. I'm struck really looking at what's going on in Ukraine today by how much of this is conditioned by the history of Ukraine. The relationship between Ukraine and Russia in particular has such an interesting and complicated history, as I'm sure you know. And if we have a slideshow on my phone, which I always carry some maps on my phone to show people. So if we could go to the first slide perhaps. Oh wait, I'm supposed to do that. Oh yeah, there we go. So as you can see on my phone here, the history of Ukraine is quite fascinating, with the original state of Rus being oriented around Kiev. Kiev is the capital of this state in the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries. And this is where and when the state of Rus, the predecessor of Russia, became Christian, with Grand Prince Vladimir in 988 converting his kingdom to Christianity. And it's really interesting that you can find statues of Vladimir now both in Kiev. It was constructed in the 1850s, and also now one in Moscow that was just built a couple of years ago. And it's so interesting to see how the history plays out in this dynamic as Russia seeks to assert kind of this foundational control of the Russian state and of Russian Christianity from Kiev and Crimea, where the traditional baptizing of Vladimir took place. Kiev, of course, lost its prominence as capital of the state of Rus in the 11 and 1200s, and then during the Mongol-Tatar yoke, we see that it ends up under control of this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And so I think this is a big theme for Ukraine, is being located at the boundary, the edge of different empires. So Ukraine nominally controlled by Poland, at least part of it, another part of it, Crimea, and around Crimea, part of the Crimean Khanate, which is a protector of the Ottoman Empire. And then Russia, and we see Russia coming back into the equation in the mid-1600s with the Treaty of Pereyaslav, which sees Kiev and the right bank of Ukraine. I guess that would be over here. We can see that map, Kiev and the east side of the Dnieper River being brought under control of the Russian Empire. And then the 1700s is where we see much of the rest of what we now call Ukraine being brought into the Russian Empire as a result of a series of wars. It's a story that has a nationalist movement that begins in the 1800s, Ukrainian nationalist movement that emphasizes Ukrainian language and literature. But it's a national movement that's ultimately repressed under the Tsarist regime. And then we get World War I and the Russian Civil War, where there are attempts to create an independent Ukraine that are ultimately unsuccessful, and Ukraine ends up as part of the Soviet Union, or at least part of it does, which you can see here. What we now call Western Ukraine is part of Poland and Czechoslovakia and Romania. And this piece, Crimea, is actually part of the Russian Federation, or the Russian Republic, excuse me, the Russian Republic, not the Ukrainian Republic. The borders shift again just prior to World War II, or at the outbreak of World War II with the Nazi-Soviet pact, allowing the Soviet Union to annex these pieces of Western Ukraine. World War II, of course, is a time of tragedy in Ukraine with German occupation, a lot of fighting. Much of Ukraine is ruined as a result of World War II. But the last interesting piece, of course, is Crimea, which in 1954 is transferred from the Russian Republic, which within the Soviet Union, to the Ukrainian Republic. And so that's a fairly recent development. Crimea, of course, has always been populated primarily by Crimean Tatars, but also secondarily by Russians as opposed to Ukrainians in terms of ethnicity and language. And so that was kind of an interesting geopolitical move made by Khrushchev when, of course, at the time it didn't really matter. But then when the Soviet Union collapses in 1991, the borders of Ukraine as they emerged during the Soviet era end up being the borders of independence. And that's been the Ukraine that has existed from 1991 until the present day, or at least until 2014 when some fairly significant events happen. So maybe we can blank my phone now for a second and get back to the conversation. But I just wondered, with that as a starting point, how are you guys are seeing things in Ukraine, maybe since independence? What are the big issues that you are noticing, and how that kind of reflects the history of this region?
Well, I guess I'd build on something that you said already, which is number one, that Ukraine has always been kind of contested territory. Its name literally means kind of at the edge, kind of it's the borderland, and
right.
So different empires have kind of competed, and poor Ukraine has always been kind of at the fringes and kind of being pulled in different directions, pulled between Europe and pulled between Russia, and that's something that continues for most of these post-Soviet states. They have to decide: are we more European or are we more Russian? And there's been a strong pull from Russia and from the West here. Lenin, the Soviet dictator, famously said that for us to lose Ukraine would be like losing our head. So Ukraine was always viewed as an extremely important part of certainly the Soviet Empire, but also viewed pretty strongly by Russian nationalists as part of their backyard, at least, if not their front porch. And so there's a kind of strong attachment there to Ukraine, and so you still see that kind of pulling back and forth. I'm glad you also emphasized Crimea there. It's worthwhile for people to remember that Crimea was historically Russian, ethnically Russian, kind of accidentally became Ukrainian for a couple decades. More than a couple, from 1954 to 2014, but that definitely sets the stage for what happened in 2014, which I'm sure we'll get back to in a second.
Yeah, interesting what you say about the name of Ukraine, because Russians will also, or have historically also called it Little Russia, and have also called that territory New Russia. Under Catherine the Great, there's this idea that Ukraine can be this kind of empty canvas, this fertile land on which we can build a new Russian society, which of course then she populates with Germans and other ethnicities, showing you that in an empire, perhaps ethnicity isn't the most important thing. Actually, some of my wife's ancestors were Germans brought to Ukraine under Catherine in the late 1700s and lived there for over 100 years.
and Putin has sometimes used that Novorossiya, New Russia kind of label, just for kicks, I guess.
Yeah, kind of repeating again the language of Russian nationalists in talking about Ukraine.
I think it's interesting when we talk about Ukraine becoming independent. What period are we talking about? Because Ukraine was part of Russia, it was one entity for so long, and it became a republic in the 1920s. Until then, there was no border to speak of. So it's thanks to the Communist Party that Ukraine, was set on the path towards independence, more significant degree of independence that we saw in the 1990s. But until then, until the 1920s, it was all one big place, one big family, and there's probably, in terms of cultural ties, Russian and Ukrainians are a lot closer than even Russian and Belarusians. I guess I should make a disclaimer that we have a political scientist and a historian here, and yes, I am a Russian and a Russian professor, but my contribution here is, I guess I'm more qualified to talk about the way Russians view Ukraine than the way Ukrainians view Russia, because I teach fourth year Russian, and what we do in that course is we read Russian news media. So it's very entertaining at times, and it's an interesting story that's being told. Of course, when we talk about media, there's state-owned media, and then there's people who watch TV, and those people who don't watch TV, they read the internet. Two very different groups of people. But the story of Ukraine that's being told in Russia is very interesting. So if at times I sound like the devil's advocate, quite literally, know where I come from. Whatever opinions I express today, I will disown them once I leave the room. But it's interesting because the cultural history behind the two, the relationships between the two people is very rich and fraught with contradictions.
But I think it's fair to say that while the Russian media doesn't always get this right, the Western media tends to have a very Western-centric view of Ukraine too, and we tend to see it through our own lens in a way that's sometimes also very problematic for what's actually going on. And we tend to view Ukraine solely in terms of, is it drawing closer to us or not? And if it's drawing closer to us, then things must be great, even if, to take an example, the most recent president is actually encouraging lots of corruption and lots of, or when the government might be pursuing things that are mistreating Russian minorities, but they're drawing closer to the European Union, so we say, yay, they're the good guys, when that probably isn't the fairest interpretation of everything that's going on. So there's some gray area in between the Western view and the Russian view, and I think in all of our classes we're trying to get closer to that gray area in between.
Well, I think it's important to remember, again, back to history. You mentioned that 1954 is when Crimea was handed over to Ukraine. And for a lot of Russians, in their minds, Crimea came back. It has returned to where it was, and it was handed over unilaterally by Khrushchev, who had ties, to Ukraine, who loved Ukraine. I think he was himself from the Donbas region.
Right.
Never in his wildest dreams could he have imagined that Russia and Ukraine would be two separate countries. And just geographically, it made sense to hand Crimea over to Ukraine. Although there are questions about the way he did it. I guess technically there was supposed to be a referendum on the Russian side, whether the Russians would agree to lose that territory. And another referendum on the Ukrainian side, where the Ukrainians would agree to accept that gift. None of that happened. Khrushchev just gave it away as a gift. So whatever happened 4 years ago, it's kind of history repeats itself. There were referendum. There was a referendum this time, and more than one. But the conversations about Crimea's unique state as an autonomous republic started in 1990, before the Soviet Union fell apart. So it's not like Putin just, woke up one day and said, let's take it back. It's, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we could just talk about how that happened back in 2014 and what led to that, because 2014 is a long ways removed from 1991, in fact, and Crimea had been part of an independent Ukraine for a number of years, and the boundaries were recognized internationally. So, I don't know, Scott, what do you think? What led Putin to make that power move to seize Crimea in 2014?
Well, I think Ukraine has been zigzagging back and forth for the last 30 years, but I think to understand what happened in 2014, you have to understand the 2010 election, when a pro-Russian president took power through free elections in Ukraine. His name was Yanukovych is probably easier for Americans to say. And I'm probably pronouncing it wrong both ways. But, okay, there we go. He tried to create closer ties to Russia, moved the country away from the EU to some extent. Also was involved in massive corruption, which is par for the course for a lot of Ukrainian and post-Soviet leaders. And in 2014, he was overthrown before the end of his term by a well, we could debate what he was overthrown by. The Western view is that there was a popular mobilization against him, known as the Euromaidan Revolution, where people came out in the streets to protest his actions. He eventually fled the country and was replaced by a new government, new elections. They elected a new pro-Western president and pro-Western legislature. And that pro-Western legislature immediately started out to make Ukraine more Western, and one of the first things they did was try to demote the status of the Russian language within Ukraine, which scared Russians, and within a couple of months of the Euromaidan Revolution, Russians were up in arms in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine in the Donbass, and Russia intervened militarily in both Crimea and the Donbass, But the justification for Russian intervention was our fellow Russians are being oppressed here. This new Ukrainian government is too pro-West. It's discriminating against Russians. Therefore, we have a right to intervene.
Yeah, there's an interesting map. Maybe if we can just pull up an image on my phone again, we can see how some of these dynamics play out. Let's see. Not that one, but this one. So this is from 2001, a percentage of the population that identified as Ukrainian-speaking or Russian-speaking. And then you're talking about elections. This is the 2004 presidential election when Yanukovych was actually defeated by Yushchenko, a kind of Ukrainian language speaker, in a contested election, actually, that resulted in very large protests in 2004 to ensure a repeat of the election that was falsified. The results were falsified initially. And you can see it, if we just look at these two maps, how closely they align, where Yanukovych, in blue, representing the Party of Regions, which is kind of the pro-Russian party, is able to carry those parts of the country in which the majority of the population, or at least a very significant minority of the population, speak Russian. Now, the interesting thing is that if you go back and look at the previous elections, 1996 and 2000, they don't really match up with this map. It's interesting, Kuchma wins in 1996 by carrying the eastern portion of the country, but then in 2000 he carries mostly the western part of the country and some of the east as well. And so kind of the formation of this really strong national Ukrainian identity and strong national kind of Russian identity within Ukraine is something that culminates, or that really crystallizes, I think, in the early 2000s, with these rival political parties that really stake their claims not on competency or anything else, but on language politics. And of course, the language laws that Poroshenko passed in 2014 were a reversal of 2012 laws that elevated Russian to a regional language status. So they hadn't been in play for that long, but it's something that had been hotly debated and contested over the previous 10, 12 years. So it's interesting when we move up to the present day then to see the results of the seizure of Crimea by Russia, or the return of Crimea to the Russian fold.
Thank you.
Combined with the war in eastern Ukraine. Here's your State Department travel warnings for US citizens. The result is that Ukraine has become much more Ukrainian. If we don't count these 3 territories that now don't participate in national elections. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic that's changed.
Yeah, and so what the map shows is the Crimea portion, which has now been annexed by Russia and is voting in Russian elections, fully integrated into Russia. And then the other red part, this Donbass region, is an area of continuing conflict. It's a war zone with continuing involvement by Ukrainian and rebel troops with Russian, the West supporting the Ukrainian army and Russia supporting the rebel armies. So these are, Crimea is no longer a war zone. It's actually very peaceful, and anyone who doesn't like the Russians being there has either moved or been jailed, essentially. But the Donbass region is still an area of intense conflict and the most discussion these days.
And I think
Donbass is right here,
Yeah.
just in case.
it's important to point out that there were Russian troops present in Crimea legally. There was an agreement.
Yeah.
You know, whatever numbers they negotiated, that's who was there. So Crimea was not invaded unexpectedly. There were Russian troops there by, Ukraine gave them the permission, and they've been there for, who knows how long.
Yeah, the
But
Russian
now
naval base since
Right.
independence
Well,
had
that's
been
the
there.
whole
Mhm.
reason why Catherine was interested in the region.
Right.
Way back when, and if we're gonna talk about, who Crimea belongs to, well, it belongs to, the Ottoman Empire. Let's go that far back, right? So it's, you can argue all kinds of things. But what I want to point out is that in Donbass, it is the rebels, it's the Ukrainians who are fighting. Yes, there's support from both sides, but there were no Russian military bases there. And right now, back to the humanitarian aspect of all of this, the Ukrainian government has withdrawn all payments to people in the public sector. There's no health support, there's no, the people, the civilians who are living there, they are on their own. And of course, Putin comes in and subsidizes whatever he can. He offers Russian passports, a faster path to citizenship for people from that region, because he claims, well, Ukrainians abandoned their own people. The Ukrainian government has abandoned their own people, so here we are, we're going to help them out.
And the Ukrainian view is they're behind enemy lines. How do we help people if we get shot at when we go near these areas? So, yeah. So this is I guess this is the current standoff, really, and the current debate. But I guess one of the things that I would emphasize, and I think it's probably clear from our discussion, is that Russia has a stronger claim to Crimea. And there's, it in many ways has a very, very strong claim to Crimea, where the Donbass, it has some potential claim in terms of history and geography and ethnic Russians, but it's a lot more mixed case here.
Well, we should mention that that's where all the natural resources are concentrated.
A lot.
That's where they're mined coal, that's where all the chemical plants and all kinds of
Right.
things. That's where the industry is. Ukraine does not want to lose that for many reasons, but that includes it. Russia has been selling oil and gas to Ukraine at deeply discounted prices for many years, for decades, and without those regions, Ukraine, the economic situation would be very dismal. So.
Yeah,
Political reasons aside, economically, Ukraine does not want to lose that region.
before 2014, these were the wealthiest regions of
Right.
Ukraine, excepting Kiev, of course, the capital. So, yeah, now that's shattered. You know, Katya, you brought up an interesting point when we saw each other the other day, this New Year's speech
Yes.
by the new president of Ukraine, Zelensky. What did you make of that?
I guess I should explain that there's this tradition in Russia. I don't know whether it's a new tradition in Ukraine or not, but
It's a pretty Soviet tradition.
pretty Soviet
Yeah.
tradition where the leader of the country gives the New Year's Eve speech addressing the populace. And Zelensky, being the newly elected president, he too gave his own address. But being a showman, it was a real show. It's not, in Russia, it's usually, well, Putin now, Yeltsin before him, with the Kremlin in the background, usually in the evening, because trying to simulate this whole New Year's Eve situation, and they address the nation and talk about this, as Zelensky says, inflation, stagnation, all kinds of throw around all these terms that nobody cares about. All people want is to just eat their salads and drink their drinks and celebrate. And Zelensky says, today, tonight it's going to be different, and I'm going to ask, I'm going to pose a question to all of you, and the question is, who are we? And then for about 13 minutes, he and other very prominent Ukrainians ask questions, kind of try to come up with possible answers about what it means to be a Ukrainian. And there are a lot of people who speak Russian. There are people from different areas, ethnically different. And he's trying to make a point that Ukraine is a very diverse country, and we can disagree with each other, but we have to respect each other, and regardless of age, political differences, all kinds of things. So he is trying to use that, and he cites cultural artifacts from like Ironia Судьбы, the Irony of Fate, is this movie that every Russian channel shows on New Year's Eve. So he incorporates all these cultural references from Russian culture, and yet he poses this question: what does it mean to be a Ukrainian? He's trying to just unify everybody. Poor guy, he's
That's quite the challenge. I've got a couple of short
You wanna
clips
show
from that speech. I wonder if we could pull that up on my phone and kind of and see what he's talking about. Fortunately, it's got some English subtitles in case we don't all speak Ukrainian.
Are you going to pull it up, or how does it work?
Yes, it's on my phone. They're going to pull it up for me on my phone. Here we go.
There he is. Maybe start at the beginning.
Національною ідеєю. Навчитись жити разом у повазі заради майбутнього своєї країни. Адже ми уявляємо його однаково. Це успішна та квітуча країна, де немає війни. Країна, яка повернула своїх людей на свої території. Де неважливо, як названа вулиця, бо вона освітлена та заасфальтована. Де немає різниці, біля якого пам'ятник ти чекаєш дівчину, в яку ти закоханий. І якщо ми бачимо майбутнє однаково, це повинно нас об'єднати.
So, I mean, you can tell that Zelensky is a TV star. I mean, it's a really slick propaganda campaign here. And it's interesting that, throughout this video he's talking about we are all Ukrainian, no matter if we speak Ukrainian or Russian or Tatar or something else. And yet he's also insisting on this point of returning territories and returning people to where they're from. And so it's kind of this, we're all Ukrainian, but there's certain things that we have to insist on. We have to insist on the integrity of our country, including Crimea, including the Donbass. And later, like you said, he looks at, or he gets input from different people from around the country speaking Russian, Ukrainian, what have you. And they too are saying we're all Ukrainian, and may the new year bring a united territory again. You know, signaling that in Ukraine there's still an appetite for continuing to oppose what they view as Russian aggression, and to not just give up Ukraine, or Crimea, excuse me, Crimea and the Donbass. So it's an interesting thing. I mean, he's talking about what should we be based on? You know, good streets. You know, he's talking about cleaning up corruption and about making Ukraine a nice place to live, part of Europe. But underneath it, there's this tension in that video with the language politics and the geopolitics.
Well, speaking of language politics, you know, as far as I know, Zelensky learned Ukrainian as an adult, and you know, he's doing a great job.
He's got Jewish heritage. I mean, he's very much a product of Soviet Ukraine.
Right, right. And going back to this idea of how close Ukraine and Russia is culturally, I'm not talking about politically, I'm talking about culturally. Again, another disclaimer, my maiden name is Ukrainian. My dad was born 30 kilometers east of Russia-Ukrainian border, so I grew up in the Urals, hearing Ukrainian speech all the time, and it was never, you know, again, it's like Khrushchev could have never imagined that Russia and Ukraine would be two different countries. It was always, you know, it was the, you can't find a culturally closer people, two peoples that are culturally closer. There we go. And it's interesting that when this, you know, the military conflict started, a lot of Ukrainians, Ukrainian refugees went all the way to Siberia. You know, why would anyone choose to move to Novosibirsk where it's cold? But it's because people had relatives. You know, there's, as Zhirinovsky said once, one of very controversial Russian leaders, Russians and Ukrainians, переженились. They married each other. You can't separate families. And there was a lot of criticism when the Soviet Union fell apart. There was a lot of criticism of Soviet leaders, specifically for, you know, severing the ties where you had to have your international passport to cross the border to go visit Kiev, and now vice versa. You know, it's just one of the examples when, you know, refugees are found, Ukrainian refugees are found as far as Siberia. And Zelensky is, you know, he mentions Novosibirsk in his New Year's address. He wants to bring everybody back. Whether he'll succeed, I hope he does. At the end of the day, you know, if we believe in true democracy, we have to ask the people what they want, and he has his, you know, work cut out.
Yeah, it certainly does.
What I noticed from that is just how, notice that 30 years after Ukraine became independent, he's still trying to convince Ukrainians what that means.
Right.
They're still trying to decide what it means to be Ukrainian, or what a Ukrainian national identity is. And it goes back to this contested empire, or contested between empires, that they're pulled in these different directions and there are different views. And so here he is 30 years after independence trying to convince Ukrainians that, hey, we should all be Ukrainians. You know, he's trying to build a national identity. And actually here he has a great ally in doing that. This is the other connection I would take from this, is one of Zelensky's great allies in building Ukrainian national identity is Vladimir Putin, who has unintentionally, no doubt, united Ukrainians to a large extent around the idea that they're picked on by Russia. Ukrainians are overwhelmingly opposed to what Russia is doing there. They're overwhelmingly opposed even to the taking of Crimea, but especially what's going on in the Donbass. There are Ukrainians homeless, displaced, dying, suffering, and they blame Russia for it to a large extent. Even the ethnically Russian-speaking Ukrainians, by and large, 90% blame Russia for what's going on, and so that it has forced public opinion in Ukraine towards more of a, we're not Russia, we're separate from Russia. Russia isn't our marriage partner, or if it is, then we're an abused spouse here, right? There's a,
Right.
you know, we no longer want to be part of that. Also, from a political standpoint, one of the things that I find is really interesting is that we showed a few of these maps of voting patterns in Ukraine before the Euromaidan revolution, and it's kind of evenly split between West and East. Well, one of the things that Putin did is he took millions of pro-Russia Ukrainian voters and made them Russian citizens. Those 2 million people that live in Crimea no longer voted, or are extremely unlikely to ever vote again in Ukrainian elections. They routinely voted for pro-Russia parties. They will no longer vote in Ukrainian elections. People in the Donbass are no longer voting in these elections. So it skewed the whole political system of Ukraine to the West. And I think in some senses this is a really ironic blowback for Putin, in that in trying to dominate Ukraine, he has in some ways created more distance between Ukraine and Russia, and that may be unintentionally the lasting consequence of what's gone on there the last few years.
You know, I wonder if we should just end with a few words about corruption, since it's been in the news so much with the impeachment trial with Burisma and these shady characters associated with Rudy Giuliani. I mean, what's your sense? I mean, is corruption in Ukraine, is it that bad? My sense is that it is, but I mean, it seems to be one of the legacies of the Soviet Union is that the corruption endemic in the Soviet system has translated over to these kind of new capitalist economic systems and just exploded. It's just gotten way worse even than it was under the Soviet Union. A few places accepted, like the Baltics, but it seems like Ukraine is one of the worst, if not the worst, in terms of corruption.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the worst, but it's definitely in the, it definitely has earned its reputation as a corrupt place. I would say in a comparative perspective, there are actually lots of other non-Soviet parts of the world that are massively corrupt too, so I don't think it's just the Soviet Union, but yeah, the Soviet Union kind of really bred corruption into the system, and Ukraine is a fairly corrupt place, which has made it complicated for the US to be involved there. What's happened with the Trump impeachment is that we've kind of, essentially what's happened is what Ukraine doesn't want. Ukraine doesn't want the political parties in the US to take sides. They want bipartisan support from Republicans and Democrats, but essentially Ukraine is being pushed to take sides here. Trump's initial campaign manager was also Yanukovych's campaign manager.
Right.
Yanukovych was the pro-Russia president who was elected in 2010 and ousted in 2014. His campaign manager, Paul Manafort, came over to manage the Trump campaign. And so a lot of this impeachment drama stems from involvement between the Trump campaign and the Yanukovych regime, this pro-Russian regime, and then of course intelligence agencies digging around in that relationship, and then the special prosecutor digging around in that relationship. That continues. The firm that's at the center of this drama, the Burisma firm that hired Hunter Biden, is also very closely associated with the Yanukovych camp. Its owner was a former minister in the Yanukovych government. So after Yanukovych was driven from power, he hired an American with a cool name in order to try to keep his influence in a post-Yanukovych Ukraine. So a lot of these debates between the pro-Western and pro-Russian forces in Ukraine are spilling over into U.S. politics.
I think the European leaders and American leaders underestimated the amount of corruption that they would have to deal with when this whole, mess started. And we should remember that, when the conflict started, America and the EU kept voting for all kinds of economic sanctions against Russia, and Germany was driving those sanctions. But it was President Obama who was in office back then, not President Trump. And a lot of Russians were wondering now, why is President Obama so interested in, number one, Ukraine, number two, those sanctions? But it was, of course, it was a way for the US to get at Russia and Ukraine. It appears, again, I told you where come from, where my information comes from. It appears, as this hostage where Ukraine was used to hurt Russia, or the conflict in Ukraine was used as an excuse to hurt Russia when all of the leaders were interested in is U.S.-Russia relationships that are always fraught with conflict. And another thing is I want to point out to just push that metaphor, family metaphor, a little further. I had a student in one of my fourth-year Russian classes who said, Crimea is a child of divorced parents. It's being, pulled in, both directions when it's really not about Crimea. It's about the two political cliques hating each other. Like at some point it gets really personal. And then again, going back to American involvement and European involvement, we have to remember NATO and the informal agreement, the informal promise that Russia was kind of, as I was told that, Gorbachev had this promise that NATO will not be moved eastward.
Disputed, of course, whether
Right.
this promise was really made.
Right. However,
Russians believe there was a promise,
Right.
and therefore they're aggravated that it wasn't
even
kept.
if there were no promise, if you have NATO troops in Crimea, Russia doesn't want NATO troops in their backyard. It's like having, Chinese military base in Baja California. I always, mention this example because it's that close, and it's not in the best Russia's interest. Putin's job as the president of the country is to protect Russia's national interest, and he's doing it. We might disagree with his methods, but anyone in his position would be, with that kind of power that he has, it would be foolish not to use it. And another thing, to kind of take a long view, Crimea was Ukrainian for 60 years. 300 years from now, no one's going to remember the 60 years. Everyone's going to remember that Putin was the president. Putin was the president that brought Crimea back. And Putin, it's a story for another day, right? But I think the people who started destabilizing the situation in Ukraine, they underestimated the repercussions, the consequences of that destabilization. Unfortunately.
I agree with that, but I'd push back a little bit on we sanctioned Russia because we were looking for an excuse to. I think you're kind of absolving Russia of any blame or involvement here in the way you put it. Maybe you didn't mean that, but I think in many ways the Obama administration actually set out to try to cooperate better with Russia. The whole Russia reset policy was an attempt to cooperate better. So I think, and I think the EU as well as the United States have been reluctant to target Russia. For me, the most interesting thing about the sanctions on Russia is how narrow they are. That they're targeted at individuals, not industries or the Russian economy more broadly. So I know from a Russian perspective, the Russian media portrays this as kind of a plot against Russia, but in many ways, the Western perspective of this is that the West has been rather restrained and kind of had to be dragged kicking and screaming into helping Ukraine here, rather than looking for an excuse to go after Russia.
I wonder if we should pause now and see if anyone else in the cafe has some questions for us.
That's always dangerous. When I've been in cafes before talking about politics with friends, if people come up to me and ask questions, I usually want to run. That's usually pretty scary. But
Let's see. So I think a reminder, we need people to come up to the microphone and say who they are, where they're from, and what their question is.
So, it is working, I'm just too short. There we go. My name's Lonnie Higgins. I'm a family history major, anthropology major as well. And my interest is, I was there in '92 as a missionary, and I always wondered what the basis of this separation, particularly with what happened in 2014 in the Donbass area, what would be the foundation as to why that separation occurred between the Ukrainians there in that area? Or is it going back to World War II, them being a resource center for supporting the military, and so they had that support from Russia, or what are your thoughts?
Do you mean in the Donbass specifically? Why is there that tension?
Yeah, why is the tension there now? Is the foundation going back to potentially during the war where they supported the military and had that support?
So one interesting thing historically is that the Soviet Union moved a lot of ethnic Russians into Ukraine in order to some extent, Russify the region, and this affected eastern Ukraine more than it did western Ukraine. They also moved a bunch of Ukrainians to the Soviet Union, often forcibly, that is into the interior of the Soviet Union, into Russia. And so you're absolutely right that World War II and kind of this era of Stalinism plays a role here. Stalin was a master manipulator when it came to nationality, and yet the Soviet Union was supposed to be this brotherhood of nations. And so when the Soviet Union falls apart, all of a sudden you don't have the communist ideology proclaiming brotherhood of nations anymore. Rather you have in its place nationalism, Russian nationalism, Ukrainian nationalism, Estonian nationalism, Tajik nationalism. And this really drives a wedge that was only kind of latently there in the Soviet period between the two ethnic groups in the region.
I think it's also interesting that, so the real trigger for the separation here of the Soviet Union was a Ukrainian referendum in December of 1991, where Ukrainians voted overwhelmingly to leave the Soviet Union. And 90% of Ukrainians supported leaving the Soviet Union, including majorities in the Donbass and Crimea, which is interesting. But I don't think it was about kind of anti-Russianness so much as we're tired of the Soviet Union, we're tired of the corruption, and believe it or not, Ukrainians at the time viewed independence as a likely panacea where we're going to be more prosperous. There was lots of belief that Ukraine had the best resources, human capital, natural resources. We're going to be the most successful of the post-Soviet republics. We want to be as independent as fast as possible. I think a lot of those people may, especially in Donbass and certainly in Crimea, regretted their votes later on and weren't as happy with it. But in 1991, these people did actually vote to leave.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Hi, I'm Emily. BYU is my alma mater, but I just live here locally now. So with Crimea, is it the kind of thing where, it seems like it's kind of a done deal, like it would be a pretty huge undertaking to do any more than just trying to keep what's going on in the Donbass area going. So is Zelensky, does it seem to you like he's just kind of like trying to still establish it, to still claim that, but he couldn't really do anything about it now? And so he's just, here's the active area, but he's going to talk big like, well, you know, they should be with us and everything. But it's pretty much like kind of over in
Yeah,
Crimea.
politically he can't renounce Crimea, but it's a fait accompli. Ukraine's not getting Crimea back in the foreseeable future. His focus is on trying to resolve the Donbass conflict, but Russia has no interest in resolving that.
We should mention that Crimea is an autonomous republic, was within Ukraine. It did in '91, you know, when the referendum took place. Crimea made sure, I guess the choice was whether it's going to stay in Ukraine or go back to Russia. Either way, it wanted to preserve the status of an autonomous republic wherever it went, which means that, you know, Crimea would have legally, theoretically, still retain the right to, you know, secede. And again, theoretically, this is what we see happening. That's the cover-up story.
Right.
Again, we may disagree with it, but that's the argument that the Russian government is using it. It had the right to do it, and it did it.
So their rhetoric is that Crimea is its own unit and it's chosen, and that they give them still some kind of autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right. Just like in the Soviet Union, every republic had the right to secede.
Just like Texas. Speaking of democracy.
My name's Jordan Heyman. I'm a geography major here at BYU. do we know how the borders of the Ukraine were demarcated, like even initially or in the modern era? Like, it's generally a flat region. How are those lines originally like decided on that this is the Ukraine?
That's a good question. Rivers, to some extent, determine this, actually to a large extent.
I would say I don't know exactly how they set the eastern boundary, but we know that it was the Bolshevik Party that set these for its own purposes. And so all boundaries are to some extent artificial and arbitrary. And the Bolshevik Party, drew boundaries in a particular direction for Ukraine. When they added more territory from Poland and Romania after World War II, they naturally kind of stuffed that on to the rest of Ukraine. Khrushchev, when he thought that Ukraine needed a 300 anniversary present, he shifted Crimea over to Ukraine just as a birthday gift, really. So all of these things happen fairly arbitrarily, and there are no kind of distinct ethnic differences there, as Katya emphasized, or Dr. Jordan emphasized. There's no kind of line where people on this side are totally different from people on that side. It's a very soft ethnic cultural boundary, so at some level you draw a line that works administratively, and then what happened in 1991 is that what no one ever expected is that those borders mattered. Those arbitrarily drawn Soviet borders suddenly became international borders, which was not anyone's intention and had all sorts of consequences that we're still dealing with.
Hi, my name is Aidan Hewson. I'm a European Studies and Russian major. I serve my mission in Kyiv. I've had all 3 in class. So we've now been through 2 Minsk agreements. We've been through countless failed ceasefires, summits. We feel like the international media has sort of withdrawn from the issue. I think people are less aware now than they used to be.
The American national media?
Yes, the Western national media, I should say. And it almost feels like we're in this sort of stalemate where the Ukrainian government wants to prove itself to Europe and the West, and therefore feels strange about compromising its boundaries, wants to show a little bit of muscle, whereas the People's Republics in Luhansk and Donetsk don't look like they're going to give up territory anytime soon. So my question is this: are you pessimistic or optimistic about the future of the conflict in the Donbas region? Where does this end, or does it ever?
Is it pro-conflict or anti-conflict?
I'm deeply pessimistic. I mean, welcome to Transnistria, welcome to Abkhazia, South Ossetia. The Donbass has just joined those ranks of these frozen conflicts, these stalemates, as you put it. Yeah.
It's not quite a frozen conflict yet, but it's a freezing conflict. There's still some.
That's right.
There is still some actual killing going on, unlike in Transnistria and these other places. But I think in the long run, it's in Russia's interest to prolong the conflict forever. They gain leverage over Ukraine and influence over what Ukraine's policies are in the future. As long as Ukraine keeps hoping to get these territories back, they keep having to deal with Russia, and it gives the Russian government a tool of influence over these areas that I think it's unlikely to give up in my lifetime.
Yeah. And we can't forget the Euromaidan that started all of this. As long as there's a conflict on the territory of Ukraine, Ukraine cannot be part of the EU.
Right.
So.
And I guess sort of just a follow-up question, especially for you, Dr. Jordan. We see this change, I think, in an intergenerational gap in Russia. It feels like the Russian youth who were born, after the fall of the Soviet Union, who don't really understand this West-East conflict. Is that something we can be optimistic about when the new generation in Russia comes to power? Do they?
Well, when you ask me a question about optimism, I can, repeat what I always say. The pessimist says, "Oh, it can't get any worse," and the optimist says, "Oh, yes, it can." I'm not sure. I don't know, it's, I think, on the one hand, the new generation is a lot more cosmopolitan. On the other hand, they're growing up, they see a different set of borders than their parents saw. And they know that they have to, when they cross those borders, they have to show their passports, and just, you know, psychologically, they know that this is a different country. And I think the difference is, you know, if Zelensky keeps doing what he's doing, and if Putin keeps doing what he's doing, culturally, the two peoples are going to keep growing apart. And it might be a good thing. There might be some healthy respect for another culture, a more pronounced identity. So let's be optimistic.
So it's instructive, I think, to remember that Navalny, Putin's biggest public critic and an inspiration to this new generation of Russians, is totally cool with the annexation of Crimea. So, you know,
It's very not black and white, is it?
yeah, I mean, a newer generation of Russians may be more pro-democracy, may be more open to civil liberties, and thinking of themselves as European, in addition to thinking of themselves as being Russian, but they still see this conflict in Ukraine in a similar way to how Putin sees it.
Please join me in thanking our discussant, conversationalists, cafe goers for conducting such an engaging conversation and allowing us to be part of that. Thank you.